James Turner's hands trembled as he scrubbed the last dish of the night, the sound of the running water echoing through an otherwise empty house. The loneliness was suffocating. He had washed the plate, fork, and mug so many times now that they had become more than just dishes. They were a reflection of the repetitive nature of his life, a life that had been spent sacrificing for others, giving until he had nothing left for himself. The mug in his hand, Evelyn's favorite, still had remnants of the pot roast they used to share on Sunday nights. But it was only a ghost of a time now long past. The kitchen was cavernous without her humming while she cooked, without her gentle scolding about leaving newspapers scattered across the table. He dried the mug carefully, placing it in the dish rack where it always sat, like a shrine to better times. The refrigerator hummed its lonely tune, decorated with faded photos held by mismatched magnets. His eyes found the picture of Dylan at his high school graduation, grinning in his cap and gown, Evelyn's arm wrapped around his shoulders. Before the arguments, before the money, before the silence, the phone's shrill ring cut through his reverie like a knife. His wet hands fumbled for the dish towel as the phone continued its insistent demand. The wall-mounted receiver felt cold against his palm as he lifted it, squinting at the caller ID through his reading glasses. The number made his breath catch. Dylan. For a moment he couldn't move. A year of silence stretched between them like an ocean. The last time they'd spoken, Dylan had stormed out after James refused to loan him money for an investment opportunity. Evelyn would have handled it better. She always knew the right words. "Hello?" James's voice came out rougher than intended. "Dad?" Dylan's voice was tentative, carrying that same uncertain tone from his childhood when he'd broken something valuable and wasn't sure how much trouble he was in. It's me." James gripped the phone tighter, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Dylan, I wasn't expecting. I know it's been—" Dylan hesitated, the line crackling faintly. "Too long. Way too long." James moved slowly to his armchair, the one Evelyn had insisted they buy because it supported his back properly. The leather was worn smooth from years of evening news and Sunday crosswords. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. "How are you, son?" "I'm good. Really good." Dylan's voice brightened. "Emma and we've been talking, and we realized how much we miss having you around. How much we miss—" The word hung in the air between them. Family. Something they'd been once before. Pride and money and stubborn silence had built walls between them. "I miss it too," James admitted, surprised by the honesty in his own voice. "Dad, would you consider coming for dinner tonight?" Dylan's voice wavered slightly. "Emma's making that pot roast you always loved, and we could talk. Really talk like we used to." James stared at the family photo on his side table. Dylan, Emma, Evelyn, and him at their wedding 5 years ago, before everything went wrong. Evelyn had always said, "Families find their way back to each other given time." Maybe she was right. Maybe families really could heal. "Tonight?" James's voice betrayed his surprise. He hadn't expected this. Dylan hadn't reached out in so long. "I know it's short notice, but Emma's already started cooking, and we don't want to wait anymore. We've wasted enough time." Something in Dylan's voice tugged at James's heart. A vulnerability he remembered from when Dylan had been small, afraid of thunderstorms. James paused. Maybe it was time. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years lifting just slightly, and said, "What time?" 7:30. I'll text you the address. We moved to Montclair last year." Montclair? Expensive territory, but then Dylan had always been ambitious. James frowned slightly, trying to process the change. Montclair was a neighborhood out of his league, a place where young professionals made their fortune and flaunted it. He couldn't help but wonder how Dylan could afford it. "I'll be there, son," James said, his voice steady. "Thank you for giving us another chance." After he hung up, James sat in the gathering silence of the living room, holding the family photo in his trembling hands. Evelyn smiled up at him from the frame, and he could almost hear her whisper, "It's time, Jonathan. It's time to come home." The silence that followed the dial tone felt different somehow, charged with possibility instead of emptiness. He set the photo carefully back on the side table and rose from his chair with a purpose he hadn't felt in months. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he'd have his son back. Upstairs, his bedroom felt like a museum of memories. Evelyn's perfume bottles still lined her dresser, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light, streaming through lace curtains. He opened his closet and pushed past everyday shirts and worn sweaters until his fingers found the navy suit hanging in protective plastic. The fabric felt substantial between his fingers, a wool blend that Evelyn had insisted on when she'd surprised him with it for Dylan's graduation. "You need something nice for important occasions," she'd said, smoothing the lapels with her careful hands. "And our son graduating is definitely important." He carried the suit to the bed and unwrapped it slowly, remembering how proud he'd felt walking into that auditorium, Evelyn on his arm, watching Dylan cross the stage. The same suit had seen him through job interviews, anniversaries, and Evelyn's funeral. Tonight, it would witness another milestone. The shower's hot water loosened muscles. He didn't realize he'd been tensing. As he shaved, he caught his reflection studying him with hopeful eyes. When had he gotten so old? The lines around his eyes had deepened, and silver now dominated his temples. Would Dylan notice? Would Emma see how lonely he'd become? Evelyn's cologne sat on the bathroom counter where he'd left it after her passing. Chanel No. 5, her Christmas gift to herself every year. He touched the bottle briefly, then reached for his own aftershave. Some memories were too precious to borrow from. Dressed and ready, he surveyed his reflection one final time. The suit still fit well, though perhaps a bit looser than before. He selected a bottle of aged whiskey from the cabinet, a peace offering, something to bridge the gap between past hurts and future hopes. His phone buzzed with Dylan's text. 247 Elmwood Drive, Montclair. Can't wait to see you, Dad. He called for an Uber, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard as he typed the address. Montclair was 40 minutes away, another world from his modest Brooklyn neighborhood. The app showed a wait time of 8 minutes. Standing by his front window, he watched familiar brownstones blur into evening shadows. Mrs. Chen from next door waved from her stoop, and he waved back, feeling lighter than he had in months. Maybe tonight would change everything. Maybe family really could find its way home. The Uber arrived precisely on time, a clean sedan with a friendly driver who commented on the nice weather. As they pulled away from the curb, and Brooklyn gave way to highways, and highways gave way to manicured suburbs, James watched the world transform outside his window. Houses grew larger, lawns more pristine, driveways wider. By the time they crossed into New Jersey, he was staring at mansions that could have housed 6 families like his. Montclair's a beautiful area, the driver remarked, noting James's wide-eyed observation. Lot of successful folks out here? Lucky man having family in a place like this, James replied, pride swelling in his chest, despite his confusion about how Dylan could afford such luxury. Lucky indeed, James thought, though unease crept into his excitement. How exactly had Dylan managed to buy a house in one of New Jersey's most expensive zip codes? The Uber slowed to a stop, before a house that belonged in architectural magazines. James sat frozen in the back seat, staring up at stone columns and perfectly manicured topiaries that probably cost more than his monthly rent. A circular driveway curved around an ornate fountain where water danced in the early evening light. 2 luxury cars, a Mercedes and a BMW, sat parked like gleaming statements of success. "This is it, sir," the driver announced cheerfully. "Beautiful place." James fumbled with his wallet, hands trembling slightly as he counted out bills and added a generous tip. "Thank you. Have a good evening." The car door felt heavier than it should have as he stepped onto pristine pavement. His shoes, polished but obviously worn, clicked against stone as he walked the curved path toward an entrance that could have belonged to a small hotel. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the walkway, and motion sensor lights illuminated his approach with theatrical precision. Before he could even reach for the brass doorbell, the massive oak door swung open. A middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes and graying hair stood in the doorway, wearing a crisp black dress that screamed, "Professional housekeeper." Her smile seemed genuine, but something flickered behind her eyes. Concern. Warning. The expression vanished so quickly, he wondered if he'd imagined it. "Mr. Turner," she said warmly, stepping aside to usher him into a foyer that made his entire living room look like a closet. "I'm Maria. Mr. Dillon and Ms. Emma are so excited you're here." The interior took his breath away. Marble floors stretched toward a curved staircase that belonged in movies about rich people. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over oil paintings that looked original and expensive. Fresh flowers, real ones, not the artificial arrangements he favored, filled the air with subtle perfume. "Dad?" Dillon's voice boomed from somewhere deeper in the house, footsteps echoing as he approached. He appeared in the foyer looking like a magazine model. Expensive suit, perfect haircut, teeth that definitely hadn't been that white at his graduation. When he reached James, his embrace felt desperate, lasting a beat too long. "You look great," he said, stepping back to study him with eyes that seemed both grateful and anxious. "Really great," Dillon added, as though trying to convince both James and himself. The air in the house felt heavy with something unspoken, a tension that clung to the perfectly decorated walls like a silent accusation. James had been in many homes over the years, homes he had built, homes he had visited, but nothing had prepared him for this. The floor beneath his polished shoes was flawless, the furniture pristine, each piece chosen with an eye for status. The contrast between this world and his own modest Brooklyn apartment was so sharp, it almost hurt. Maria led him through the foyer, the smooth marble floors reflecting his hesitant steps. As he moved deeper into the house, his chest tightened. Every room felt like a museum exhibit, sterile and cold, full of items meant to impress but failing to feel like home. Dillon's success, if you could call it that, was on full display luxury cars parked in the driveway, high-end appliances that gleamed under the soft lighting, and the lingering smell of pot roast, Evelyn's recipe, filling the air. "Right this way," Maria said, her smile still warm, but carrying an undertone of something darker, something that made James uneasy. She ushered him toward the living room, where a large fire crackled in the hearth, the orange flames casting long shadows against the walls. "Thank you," James murmured, trying to adjust to the opulence. It was hard to imagine that his son, the same boy who had run through his kitchen barefoot, had once lived in a home so ordinary, so filled with the scent of home-cooked meals and the clutter of daily life. Now, Dillon had replaced those memories with something that felt almost fake, a life built on appearances rather than connection. When they entered the living room, James's heart sank. Dillon was standing near the window, dressed in a sharp suit that seemed to accentuate his growing distance from the man he used to be. Emma stood beside him, her smile wide but rehearsed, her posture perfect, like a model posing for a magazine spread. The contrast was jarring. "Dad," Dylan said with an enthusiasm that almost felt forced. He moved toward him quickly, his arms outstretched in a hug that seemed desperate, like a man trying to convince himself that everything was fine. "You look great. Really great." James stiffened for a moment before wrapping his arms around his son, unsure whether to return the warmth or to step back and keep his distance. When Dylan pulled away, there was something in his eyes, something that didn't belong there, a flicker of unease that James couldn't ignore. He wasn't sure if it was the alcohol already settling in his stomach, or if it was the growing weight of his own suspicion, but Dylan didn't seem like the boy who had once told him everything. "Good to see you, Dad," Dylan continued, his voice light, almost too casual. "I'm so glad you came." James looked over at Emma, who had stepped forward with the same practiced grace. She was stunning in a silk dress that shimmered under the light. Her makeup was perfect, the kind of beauty that could belong to anyone in a magazine, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something unsettling about her smile. Something too perfect. "Jonathan," she said, using his full name, a touch of formality that felt deliberate. She leaned in, kissing him on the cheek, her perfume wafting toward him like an invisible wall. "We're so happy you're here. You look wonderful." "Thank you," he replied, giving a tight smile. The warmth of her greeting didn't reach his heart. He could sense something in her gaze, something calculating. It felt as though she was measuring him, waiting for something he couldn't name. "Have a seat," Dylan said, gesturing toward the luxurious leather chairs. "We've been meaning to have a real conversation. Catch up, you know?" James sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the chair beneath him. It was plush, expensive, and too big, as if the house had been built to swallow him whole. He glanced around, taking in the elaborate decor, the art on the walls that screamed money rather than sentiment. "This is incredible," he said, trying to mask the unease gnawing at him. The place was beautiful, but it wasn't home. The warmth of his own kitchen, with its worn countertops and mismatched chairs, felt more like family than this perfect display ever could. "Thank you," Emma replied, settling into a chair beside him. She picked up her glass of wine and sipped delicately, watching him over the rim. "We wanted you to see how well we've been doing. You've worked so hard all your life, and it's time you see the fruits of your labor. Dylan's done so much. This place is his success." James swallowed hard, feeling the bite of her words. She was right, in a way. Dylan had worked hard, but at what cost? James had built a life on hard work and sacrifice, not on gambling and making deals that he could barely understand. This wasn't the world he had worked so hard to provide for his son. "We've been doing well," Dylan added, his voice a little too eager. "Caught the market just at the right time. Lucky timing, really." The way Dylan said it didn't sit well with James. It was too casual, too rehearsed, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as his father. James leaned back, studying his son's face, trying to see beyond the polished exterior. Was this really the same boy he had raised? The same young man who had once looked up to him for guidance? "Lucky timing," James repeated slowly, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Is that what it takes? Lucky timing?" Dylan smiled, but there was something hollow in his eyes. "Well, yeah, but we both know it takes more than luck, right?" He set down his drink, leaning forward. "It's not just about luck. It's about knowing how to make the right moves." James felt a pang in his chest, a sharp reminder of everything he had sacrificed, everything he had built with his own 2 hands. This wasn't the world he had imagined for Dylan. "So, what's next?" James asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "You're going to keep building this empire?" Dylan's eyes brightened, a flicker of excitement crossing his face. "Actually, yes, but there's something else, something big." He paused, as if to let the weight of his words settle between them. "We want to talk to you about the future. Your future, Dad." Emma placed her hand on his arm, her fingers lingering a moment too long. "You've built such an incredible legacy," she said softly. "But have you thought about, well, passing it on? We've been talking about it for a while now, and we think it's time." James's stomach churned. It was a question that seemed innocuous, but it carried a weight he wasn't prepared for. Passing it on? His empire? His hard work? What did they mean by that? "Pass it on?" James repeated, his voice thick with confusion. "To you?" "To us," Dylan said, his voice firm now, no trace of hesitation. "It's time, Dad. It's time to let go. Let Emma and me take care of things from here." Something in James's chest constricted. His first instinct was to refuse, to push back against the idea that he would just hand over everything he had built. But the words didn't come. He sat there, frozen, trying to process the gravity of what Dylan was saying. The conversation lingered in the air, thick with tension. James knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about passing on his business. This was about control. And it wasn't just Dylan who was making this request, it was Emma, too. I need some time to think," James said quietly, his mind racing. There was something off about all of this, something that he couldn't place. Dylan's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it. "Of course, we just thought it was time to have the conversation." Before James could respond, his phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. The text that followed sent a cold shiver down his spine. "They're planning to move soon. Don't let them fool you." The smell of pot roast filled the room, thick and warm, but instead of comfort, it triggered a flash of memories for James. Evelyn had always been the one to make it, the dish they'd shared countless times during family holidays. But now, as he sat at the pristine dining table, the scent felt like an accusation. This meal wasn't meant to bring them back together, it was part of the show. The house was perfect, everything in its place, just like Emma and Dylan. From the flawless china to the polished silverware, the presentation screamed wealth and success, but the warmth James once felt for his family, for this home, was gone. His son was different now. The boy who used to need him was now an adult who had learned to hide his true intentions behind charm and wealth. And Emma, she was always the picture of elegance. But tonight, something in her eyes made James uneasy. "Isn't this wonderful, Dad?" Dylan said, his voice almost too bright, as he set down a large, empty wine glass in front of James. "We wanted to make tonight special. After everything, we just felt like it was time to reconnect." James studied his son's face. There was a desperation behind the polished smile. Dylan's eyes darted nervously toward Emma, who placed her wine glass on the table with a practiced smile, as if everything was normal. But it wasn't. None of this was normal. It's very nice, Dylan," James said slowly, his voice thick with hesitation. He picked up the glass, his fingers wrapping around the crystal stem, but he didn't drink. The whiskey from earlier still clung to the back of his throat, making him uneasy. "We've missed you, Dad," Emma said, leaning forward just a bit too eagerly. "You've worked so hard your whole life. It's time to let go of the reins, don't you think?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. Instead, He took a deep breath, forcing his shoulders to relax. Let go of the reins? It was all starting to make sense now, the questions, the urgency, the way they kept pushing him, like they were trying to wear him down. We just want you to enjoy life now, Emma continued, her tone saccharine sweet, as she reached across the table to gently touch his hand. No more work, no more stress. Let us take care of things. We've got it all figured out. James's gaze flicked to Dylan. His son looked away quickly, as if he were hiding something. It was all too perfect, too rehearsed. Every word, every smile, every gesture felt like a carefully orchestrated play. He'd seen this before. Dylan and Emma weren't offering him freedom, they were setting him up. The pot roast, perfectly cooked, sat on the table in front of him. He could feel his stomach churn, the tension thick in the air. It wasn't just about the dinner. It wasn't just about the food or the wine. This was a game where he was the pawn, and they were the players. So, James said, setting the wine glass down with a deliberate slowness. What's this really about? Dylan froze for a second, his hand halfway to his own wine glass. Emma's smile faltered, and for the first time since James arrived, there was a flicker of something unguarded in her eyes, nervousness, maybe even fear. I don't know what you mean, Dad, Dylan said, his voice wavering just slightly. He quickly regained his composure and forced a smile. We're just trying to reconnect. It's been so long. James leaned back in his chair, studying his son carefully. Reconnect? Or are you trying to get me to sign something? There it was. His son's expression shifted, just a fraction, but it was enough. Dylan's eyes darted toward Emma, who had gone unnaturally still, her hand resting on her lap. Dad, Dylan said, the tension in his voice barely masked. You're overthinking this. We just want to be a family again. James's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. And why is it so urgent? Why now? After all this time, why the sudden change? The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Emma shifted in her chair, her eyes flicking between James and Dylan. There was something about the way she was sitting too still, too perfect, that made James's instincts scream. The meal in front of him felt like it was suffocating him, the rich smell of the pot roast mixing with the tension in the air. It was almost as if the whole room had been designed to force him into a corner, to make him feel small, insignificant. Everything from the polished silver to the flickering candlelight felt like part of a trap. Dad, Dylan said, his voice a little too sharp now. You need to trust us. We've worked so hard to make this happen. We've both sacrificed a lot to get here, and we want you to share in that success. You don't have to worry anymore. You deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor. James's heart clenched. He had worked hard. He had sacrificed everything for his family, for his son. And this? This was how they repaid him. With manipulation. With lies. He couldn't sit here any longer, playing along with their charade. The stakes had become too clear, the game too transparent. He had spent his entire life building something that was meant to last. But now, it was all at risk. Let's get one thing straight, James said, his voice quiet but firm. I'm not here to hand over my life's work to anyone. The room fell dead silent. Dylan's smile faltered, and Emma's grip on her glass tightened. They hadn't expected this response. They thought they could manipulate him, make him feel grateful for their generosity. But they were wrong. James stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The calmness of his movement contrasted with the fury building inside him. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. But this was the only way. He couldn't let them take what he had worked for. Not now. Not ever. I think it's time for me to go. James said quietly, his eyes never leaving Dylan's. "I've had enough of this." Dylan opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a faint, rapid knock echoed from the front door. James turned toward the sound. It was too quick, too abrupt to be a casual visitor. He knew that knock. It was official. It was urgent. James's heart skipped a beat as the door opened, and he saw the flash of blue and red lights through the window. A sudden, undeniable sense of dread filled the pit of his stomach. Something was about to change. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, and James's stomach tightened with an unfamiliar dread. The officers stood there, their figures filling the doorway with authority and purpose. They were dressed in plain clothes, but the calm professionalism in their eyes was unmistakable. James knew this moment was inevitable, that it had been coming ever since he first walked into Dylan's house. But the shock still struck him like a punch to the gut. "Mr. Turner?" the officer asked, his voice steady but carrying the weight of an unspoken command. James blinked, the words sinking in slowly. The night had shifted in an instant from one of uncomfortable family tension to something far more dangerous. "Yes?" he managed to say, his voice raspy. He stepped back, away from the threshold, feeling the sudden chill in the air. Dylan and Emma stood frozen behind him, their faces drained of color. It was as if they hadn't expected the officers to show up tonight, perhaps never at all. "We need to speak with you," the officer said, his expression unreadable. "About what?" James's pulse raced, the discomfort of the evening now escalating into fear. The clarity of the situation hit him like a hammer. Something wasn't right. His instincts told him that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something far darker. "We have reason to believe that you are in immediate danger, Mr. Turner," the officer continued, stepping forward slightly as if to make sure James didn't retreat any further. "We've been investigating a potential case of elder abuse and fraud." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Fraud? Elder abuse? The room seemed to spin around him as the officer's words hung in the air. Dylan stepped forward, his face going pale, but his voice remained steady. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, trying to mask the anxiety creeping into his voice. James didn't know how to respond. The fear had settled in his bones now, cold and unrelenting. He glanced at Emma, but her face had gone ashen. She avoided his gaze, her fingers gripping the edge of the dining table as though she was holding on to her last shred of control. James began, but the officer cut him off. "We have a few questions about a financial transaction that occurred recently," the officer said. "It seems there are legal documents indicating you may have been coerced into signing over assets. We have reason to believe you were manipulated." James felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. The realization hit him harder than the whiskey had when they'd first made him drink it. The puzzle pieces of that evening, the oddities, the unnerving warmth in Dylan's and Emma's behavior were coming together in a rush of clarity. This wasn't just about dinner. This wasn't about a family reunion. This was a well-planned attack, an attack on everything he'd worked for. Emma took a step forward, her calm demeanor cracking for the first time. "What is this about?" she demanded, her voice louder than before, her eyes darting nervously to Dylan. "There's been some mistake, officer. My husband hasn't done anything wrong. We're just—" "Ma'am, please step back," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We're not here to discuss anything at this moment except for your father-in-law's safety. Now, Mr. Turner, if you'll come with us, we'll explain everything at the station." James stood frozen, the chaos of the evening swirling around him. He wanted to say something, to demand answers, to shout at Dylan, to ask how long this had been planned, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded slowly, his hand shaking as he wiped the back of his neck. I need to grab my coat, he finally muttered, his mind racing, his body feeling more distant with each passing second. Dylan and Emma exchanged a glance, their panic palpable in the way they shifted uneasily behind him. Neither of them spoke as James turned and walked toward the coat rack by the front door. It felt almost absurd to be standing here in a house that felt like a stranger's, a place where his own flesh and blood had manipulated him so expertly. He didn't know what to think or what to do, but he knew he had to see this through. With trembling hands, he grabbed his coat and draped it over his shoulders. The house, once so full of life, now seemed hollow, each corner echoing the emptiness inside him. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had always thought he knew his son. But tonight, he had learned the hard way that the man Dylan had become was not the boy he had raised. As the officer led him outside, James glanced over his shoulder one last time, locking eyes with Dylan. His son's face was full of tension, the corners of his mouth twisted in a way that suggested he was trying to maintain control, but failing. Emma stood silently behind him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and there was something there, something deep and unsettling, a feeling that told him this wasn't over yet. The cool night air bit at his skin as they stepped outside, the harsh lights of the police car illuminating the driveway. The sound of tires on gravel felt like the only noise in the world. James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the betrayal. He'd worked for decades to build something lasting, something meaningful, and his own flesh and blood had turned it all into a game. He climbed into the back of the police car, the door slamming shut behind him with a sense of finality. As the officer slid into the front seat, the car pulled away from Dylan's house, the suburban streets blurring in the rear-view mirror. James's mind raced, his thoughts spinning as he stared out the window, the homes they passed flickering in the darkness. Everything he had worked for was slipping away. The empire he and Evelyn had built, the family he had sacrificed so much for, none of it mattered anymore. He didn't know where this was going, or what would happen next. But he knew one thing for certain. He would not let them take it from him without a fight. The cold air of the police car felt different now. It wasn't just the chill of the night creeping in. It was the cold reality of what had happened. The sirens were off, and the headlights cut through the darkened streets of Montclair, painting everything in sharp, unnatural light. James's fingers curled around the edge of the seat as they drove, his body stiff with a mix of anger and disbelief. Everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build, was being taken from him and by his own son. He had always told himself he knew Dylan. He had always thought he could trust him. But what kind of man had his son become? A man so desperate, so blinded by ambition, that he would betray the very person who had given him everything? The thought twisted in James's gut, and for a moment he wondered if he would ever see his son the same way again. The car turned sharply, and the familiar streets of Brooklyn came into view. James barely registered the passing scenery. His mind was still on that dinner table, the forced smiles, the rehearsed pleasantries. And then, the police had arrived. The knock on the door that shattered everything. Dylan's perfect life, his perfect facade, all coming undone in a matter of minutes. As the car pulled up to the police station, James's stomach tightened. He had never imagined being here like this. But as the car came to a stop, the officer turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Turner, we need to take your statement. It'll be a few minutes. You can wait inside or in the lobby, whichever you prefer." James nodded, his eyes focused on the station ahead. He couldn't bring himself to speak. What was there to say? The world he had built was crumbling, and the betrayal was so deep, so painful, that he didn't even know where to start. He stepped out of the car, the cold pavement biting at his worn shoes. The officers guided him into the station, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they walked down the narrow corridor. It all felt too surreal. He had been a father, a provider, a man who had worked tirelessly to give his family everything they could ever want. And yet here he was, standing in a cold, sterile hallway, facing the reality that the people he trusted the most were the ones who had brought him down. Inside the station, the hum of activity barely registered. The noise of typing keyboards, the occasional murmur of voices, it all seemed distant, almost muffled, like he was trapped in a bubble. He was led to a small room, its walls bare except for a few posters on the bulletin board, all about safety tips and crime prevention. The officer handed him a seat and sat across from him. He glanced over at the paper on the desk, his statement, his truth. His hand hovered over the pen for a moment, and then, as if by instinct, he picked it up. He couldn't delay this any longer. The officer's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Turner, we need to go over the details of your situation. Please start from the beginning. We'll need a full account of everything." James's mind raced. The beginning? Where did it all begin? The dinner, the lies, the betrayal, but it was more than that. It was a lifetime of sacrifice, of giving until there was nothing left to give. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse from the strain. "I've worked my whole life to build something for my family," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "I put in the hours, the blood, the sweat, all for them, for my wife, Evelyn, for Dylan. And for what? To have it all thrown away by the people I trusted the most." His thoughts spiraled back to the dinner. He could still see the way Dylan had looked at him, the nervousness, the eagerness to please, to show him that he had made it. But there was something beneath it, something darker that James hadn't been able to put into words until now. "The night we sat down for dinner, Dylan, he invited me over. He said they wanted to make things right. To reconnect," James continued, his grip tightening around the pen. "But when I got there, something felt wrong. It didn't feel like the reunion I had hoped for. It felt like a show." The officer nodded but didn't interrupt. He simply took down the details, his pen scratching across the paper, but James was no longer focused on the officer. His mind was still at that dinner table. He could see Emma's face, her false warmth, the way she had touched his hand with a little too much pressure, like she was trying to anchor him in her world. And Dylan, his son, had looked at him with too much expectation, too much calculation. "They wanted me to sign something," James continued. "They kept pushing me, asking me about my business, about my retirement plans. But it wasn't just about that. It was about control, about taking what I've worked for." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Taking what you've worked for?" James nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "Yes, they had papers ready. Legal documents, power of attorney, business transfer papers. They wanted me to sign everything over to them." A cold, bitter laugh escaped James's lips, and he shook his head. "I wasn't going to fall for it. Not then, not ever, but they tried. They tried to poison me, to make me weak, to get me to sign." The officer's eyes widened slightly. "Poison?" "Yes," James said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "They spiked my drink. That's why I felt dizzy, why I couldn't think straight. It was all part of their plan. I wasn't supposed to remember what happened." The officer leaned forward, his face hardening. "Do you have the documents? Anything that proves what you're saying?" James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folder he had grabbed earlier from the table. It was heavy with papers. He placed it on the desk, the sound of it thudding against the wood loud in the quiet room. "They had everything ready. The signatures, the transfer of assets, the plans, it was all set up. I was just supposed to sign and hand over everything I built. The officer took the folder, flipping through the papers. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle over James. This was real. They had tried to steal everything from him. His empire, his legacy, his son had been a part of it. "We'll need to investigate further," the officer said, scanning the documents. "This is serious. We'll make sure it doesn't go unnoticed." James exhaled slowly, feeling a strange sense of relief, but it was tempered by the anger boiling inside him. He had done the right thing. He had stopped them. But what would happen next? What would Dylan and Emma do when they found out he had gone to the police? The stakes were higher now, and he could feel the pressure mounting. As the officer stood up, preparing to leave, James felt his heart race again. He wasn't out of danger yet. He had only just begun to fight back. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him felt like the final seal on a chapter he could never undo. James turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as the man in the suit stepped into the small, stark room. The officer who had been taking his statement paused mid-motion, his expression shifting to one of wary professionalism. The man didn't offer a handshake. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the room, suffocating it. A sense of power emanated from him, his polished shoes clicking across the floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable moment. He stopped near the desk, glancing at the papers James had handed over. His cold eyes met James's for the briefest second, and in that exchange, James knew this was no ordinary visitor. "Mr. Turner, I'm glad we could finally meet," the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. His suit was expensive, the kind of fabric that cost more than James's entire yearly salary. The sharp creases, the sheen of his tie, all spoke of a life lived in comfort, built on power and control. "I've been hearing a lot about you." James stayed silent, the blood in his veins turning cold. This man knew too much, and he wasn't here to offer help. He had to be a part of it. Another cog in the machine that had been built to destroy everything he had worked for. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice surprisingly steady, though his heart was pounding. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been looking out for the interests of your son," the man said with a glint of something darker in his eyes. "You've got a lot of people behind you, Mr. Turner, people who are concerned about how things are moving." The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between the two men. "What's this about?" he asked cautiously. The suited man didn't acknowledge him at first. He seemed to relish the tension in the room before turning back to James. "You see, your son has gotten himself in a bit of trouble. There are debts to be settled, and your decision to get the law involved. Well, it complicates things." James's chest tightened. The words felt like poison dripping into his ears. He already knew about the gambling, the loans, the debt that had been hanging over Dylan's head like a dark cloud. But hearing it from this stranger made everything more real. The threat was no longer an abstract fear, it was breathing down his neck. "Your son owes a lot of money to some very dangerous people," the man continued. "People who don't take kindly to things not going their way." James felt his fists clench involuntarily. The realization of how deep the hole Dylan had dug for himself went sinking in. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about survival. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked, his voice quiet, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. The man leaned in, lowering his voice as though sharing some twisted secret. "Because, Mr. Turner, it's in your best interest to leave things alone. The police have been sniffing around, and that's a problem. It's making things harder for everyone involved. Your son's actions are going to have consequences. And if you keep pushing this, well, those consequences will ripple out to you as well." James's heart sank. This wasn't just about the business. This wasn't just about Dylan's betrayal. This was something far darker. The people behind this, the real players, had their sights set on more than his business. They were threatening his life, and by extension, everything he'd built. "Is this a threat?" James's voice was low, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Turner. I'm simply giving you a choice. Let your son handle his debts and move on, or I can make things harder for you. For your family." The words hung in the air like poison. James's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them manipulate him into backing down. But what choice did he have? What could he do against people like this? For the first time in what felt like forever, James allowed himself a brief moment of doubt. He had sacrificed everything for his family, his time, his health, his very soul, and now this? This was how they were repaying him? "Let me make myself clear," the man continued, his tone never wavering. "You can't fight this. The longer you press, the worse it will get. You're just a piece in a much bigger game. I suggest you step aside before the game plays you." James's mind was reeling. His instincts were screaming at him to act, to make a decision, to fight back. But what could he do? His son was caught in something far beyond him, and no matter how much he wanted to protect Dylan, he couldn't ignore the danger to himself, to everything he had worked for. The officer shifted again, looking increasingly uncomfortable as he observed the exchange. But it wasn't his place to intervene. The man in the suit had made it clear that he had the power here. The power that came with money, influence, and the kind of ruthless ambition that James couldn't even begin to comprehend. "I'm going to make this simple for you, Mr. Turner," the man said, his voice like silk over steel. "You back off, or things will escalate quickly. We've made our point. You don't want to be involved in this any more than you already are. Do yourself a favor and leave it alone." James's breath came in sharp, quick gasps as his heart hammered in his chest. He had spent his whole life working for something, working to create a legacy for his son. And now, that legacy was slipping through his fingers. Not just because of Dylan's actions, but because of the people lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking beneath him, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to make a choice, face these people and risk losing everything, or walk away, allowing the people who had betrayed him to win. "Leave it alone, Mr. Turner," the man said one last time, his voice soft but final. James turned his back on him, walking toward the door. He couldn't do it. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he had come this far. The officer's voice was soft but firm as he stood up, too. "We'll have to proceed with the investigation, Mr. Turner. But know this, the deeper you go, the more you risk." James nodded slowly, but his mind was already made up. The fight was just beginning. As the final events unfolded, James found himself standing on the precipice of a life he once thought he knew. The world he had built, a world of hard work, sacrifice, and family, had been shattered. But through the dust and the betrayal, something profound emerged. What he had once given away freely, his time, his efforts, his very sense of self-worth, was now being taken back, piece by piece, with quiet strength. This wasn't just about his empire, or the money, or the betrayal of a son he had loved so deeply. It was about reclaiming the one thing that had been lost amidst it all, his dignity. For too long, James had defined himself by what he could do for others. He had lived his life for his family, his legacy, his son believing that love meant sacrifice, and that his worth was tied to the needs of those around him. But as the layers of deception were peeled back, he saw the truth for what it was. His value was not in what he could give, but in who he was. He was more than just a provider. He was more than just a father who had been taken for granted. He was a man who had the power to take control, to set boundaries, and to say, "No more." This journey wasn't just about family or business. It was about reclaiming himself. He had spent so many years building his life around others' needs that he had forgotten to build himself into the man he wanted to be. Now, standing on the other side of this betrayal, James had learned the hardest lesson of all: respect, whether from family or from strangers, must be earned, and it starts from within. He had to stop letting the arrogance of others dictate his worth. He had to stop letting the actions of those he loved define his value. The strength it took to walk away from the life he had built, to say goodbye to the people he had once called family, was immense. But in doing so, he had reclaimed his power. No longer would he be the victim of his circumstances or the manipulations of those who saw him as nothing more than a tool for their own gain. He had found his voice, his confidence, his self-respect, and no one could take that from him. James knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be struggles, there would be setbacks, and there would be moments of doubt. But one thing was certain: he was no longer the man who had blindly given everything without considering the cost to himself. He had learned that true strength lies not in sacrifice alone, but in knowing when to stand up for yourself, to assert your worth, and to demand respect no matter who stands in your way. This was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where James could finally embrace his own worth, his own identity, and his own peace. And while the road to healing and justice was long, it was a road he no longer had to walk alone. The strength he had found within himself would guide him through the storm. So, as you sit here, listening to this story, remember your worth is not determined by the sacrifices you make for others. It is not found in the approval of those who take you for granted. Your worth is intrinsic, unwavering, and deserves to be respected by everyone you allow into your life. You are not just a tool to be used. You are a person with your own dreams, your own desires, and your own right to happiness and peace. If you've enjoyed this story, and if it's resonated with you, please give it a like and comment number 1 below to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, where we'll bring you more powerful stories that speak to the heart, the soul, and the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for being part of our journey, and we'll see you in the next story.